My name is Nora Whitfield, and for 31 years I managed a bank branch on Cumberland Street. I approved loans. I caught 2 embezzlers before they made it past their first quarter. I once refused to let a man withdraw $9,000 in cash because something about his eyes reminded me of every fraud bulletin I'd ever read. And I was right. That instinct never retired, even after I did. So when I tell you that a man named Richard Hale asked me for $15,000, and I said, yes, I need you to understand something first. I knew exactly what he was. I had known for 6 weeks. And what I sent him back was not money. It was a signature he'd have to give me with his own hand. But that comes later. Let me back up, because the part that still keeps me up some nights isn't the ending. It's how good he was at the beginning. How much I wanted him to be real, even with everything I knew sitting in a folder on my kitchen table. I was 73 years old. My husband Gerald had been gone 4 years hard, fast, no warning, gone before the ambulance turned onto our street. After the funeral, after the casseroles stopped coming, the house got quiet in a way I didn't have a name for. Not lonely, exactly, untenanted, like a building with all the right furniture and nobody home. My daughter Claire called every Sunday at 5. My son lived in Seattle and called less than that, which was its own kind of grief I didn't discuss with anyone. I had my garden, my church group, a standing Tuesday lunch with 2 women who'd also buried husbands, and understood that you don't have to perform grief to be carrying it. And I had, against every piece of professional caution I'd spent 3 decades building, a Facebook account. Claire set it up so I could see pictures of the grandkids. That's all it was supposed to be. 6 months after Gerald died, a message came in from a man named Richard Hale. His profile picture showed a silver-haired man in a tan blazer, standing in front of what looked like an oil rig. Civil engineer, it said. Currently on contract in the Gulf. Widower his wife had passed 3 years prior. Cancer, no children. The message was simple. He said he'd seen a comment I left on a gardening group about hybrid tea roses, and that his late wife had grown them too, and that something about the way I described pruning them made him think I might be someone worth talking to. I want to tell you I was suspicious from the first line. I wasn't. I was flattered, and lonely, and curious. In that order. We talked for 11 days before he asked anything of me at all, not money, not even my phone number, just conversation. He asked about Gerald. He listened, actually listened, when I told him about the roses Gerald planted the year before he died, how I couldn't bring myself to dig them up, even though half of them had gone wild and tangled. Some things you don't prune, he wrote. You just let them grow how they want to grow now. I remember reading that twice. I remember thinking, this is either a very thoughtful man or someone who has done this enough times to know exactly which sentence works. I didn't know yet that it was the second one. But some small cold part of me, the part that spent 31 years watching people lie about money, filed the thought away and didn't let it go. Here's something I need you to know about me, so the rest of this makes sense. I wasn't naive. I'd trained junior loan officers to spot exactly this kind of grooming, the slow build trust before the ask. I'd seen elderly customers come into my branch wanting to wire their life savings to men they'd never met, and I'd talked 4 of them out of it personally. Sat with them in my office while they cried with relief or fury, depending on how close they'd come. I knew the shape of this story before I was 3 weeks into living it, which meant the real question of this story was never going to be whether I'd get fooled. It was going to be what I planned to do about it. And I want to tell you exactly when that plan started, because it wasn't where you'd expect. For the first 2 months, Richard never mentioned money once. Not a hint, not a need, nothing. We talked every day long messages in the morning, shorter ones at night before bed, the rhythm of it becoming something I looked forward to in a way that embarrassed me a little. He told me about a contract he was finishing on an oil platform off the coast of Nigeria, said the engineering firm flew him out for 8-month stretches because he specialized in something called subsea pipeline integrity. Said the isolation out there was brutal, but the pay made it worth it for one more contract before he retired for good. He sent pictures, sunsets over water, a grainy photo of him in a hard hat, squinting at the camera, the rig's metal structure behind him. A photo of a small dog, he said, belonged to another worker on the platform, a stray they'd adopted as a kind of mascot. I looked at every single one of those pictures more times than I'd like to admit. What I didn't do, and this is the detail that matters, was stop being who I was for 31 years. While Richard and I exchanged good mornings and good nights, I was also, quietly, doing what I'd trained an entire branch of employees to do. I ran a reverse image search on his profile photo during week 3. It came back to a stock photography site, the same image used under at least 4 other names across different platforms, a financial advisor in Toronto, a lonely widower on 2 other dating sites, and once, bizarrely, as a testimonial photo for a supplement company. I didn't confront him. I didn't block him. I sat with that information for a full day, and then I opened a fresh document on my computer and titled it RH, and started writing down dates. I want to explain why I didn't simply end it there, because that's the question everyone asks me now, and it's a fair one. If I'd disappeared the moment I found the fake photo, he'd simply have moved to his next target, someone less prepared than I was. Someone without 31 years of fraud training, sitting quietly in the back of her mind. Confidence and romance scams cost Americans hundreds of millions of dollars a year, and the people 60 and older carry a disproportionate share of that loss, year after year, because they're patient, trusting, and often alone in exactly the way that makes a stranger's attention feel like rescue. For every Nora Whitfield who catches the fake photo in week 3, there's a woman who doesn't catch it at all, who wires her retirement before anyone tells her to stop. I didn't want to just close my laptop and protect myself. I wanted to make it cost him something to ever try this again. That decision made alone, at my kitchen table, before I'd told a single living soul, is the real beginning of this story. Everything else is just how I carried it out. There's a second thing I need to be honest about, because pretending otherwise would make me a worse narrator of my own life than I want to be. I liked talking to him. Or rather, I liked talking to whoever was actually typing those messages, because I'd learn, much later, that Richard Hale wasn't one person at all, not in any way that mattered. But the conversations themselves, the daily rhythm of someone asking how my day was and seeming to actually want to know, that had filled a hole in my life that 4 years of widowhood had carved out and never quite finished hollowing. I'm not ashamed of that. I think it's the most honest thing I can tell you. Loneliness doesn't make you stupid. It makes you susceptible to things you'd normally see coming from a mile off, even when, like me, you do eventually see them coming. So I kept talking to him. And I kept my file. By week 5, the story deepened in the way these stories always do. He told me about a daughter from his first marriage, estranged. A complicated relationship he was working to repair. He told me his late wife's name was Eleanor, and that he still wore her wedding ring on a chain around his neck, which he said embarrassed his daughter when she'd visited him once, years back, before things went cold between them. Small, specific, human details, the kind that make a story breathe instead of just sitting flat on a page. I noted every one in my file, because I'd learned that scammers reuse details across victims more often than people realize. And if Eleanor or subsea pipeline integrity or that exact dog photo turned up anywhere else, I wanted to know. It was during week 6 that the first ask came. Not for money, for my address. I want to send you something, he wrote. Nothing extravagant, just something that says I'm thinking of you. 3 days later, a box arrived. Inside was a silk scarf, pale blue, genuinely lovely, and a card with his handwriting, or someone's handwriting, performing his that said he'd seen the color and thought of the sky over the rig at dawn, The only beautiful thing about that platform, besides the dog. I want you to sit with that for a second, because it's the part most people miss about how this works. He spent real money on me. $40, maybe $50 on a scarf and shipping. Not because he liked me, though. By then I think some genuinely small, strange part of whoever was behind that account did enjoy our conversations. The way you can enjoy a job you're also exploiting, but because the gift was an investment. It made the next ask feel reciprocal instead of one-sided. It made it feel like a relationship instead of a transaction. That's also when I started keeping the box. Not the scarf, the box it came in. The shipping label, the return address, a fulfillment center in New Jersey, which told me nothing about Richard, but told me a great deal about the kind of operation I was actually dealing with. This wasn't one lonely engineer on an oil rig. This was infrastructure. Someone running gift shipping logistics for what I now suspected was more than one Richard Hale, more than one fabricated widower working more than one Nora. I called my daughter Claire that week and told her, carefully, that I'd met someone online and that I wanted her to know about it, just so somebody does. I didn't tell her I knew it was a scam. I let her worry exactly the amount a daughter should worry, because if everything I was building went sideways, I wanted at least one person who already had context, who wouldn't be starting from zero. Claire's first reaction was the one you'd expect. She went quiet on the phone in a way that told me she was choosing her words, and then she said, "Carefully, Mom. I need you to be careful. People do this. They target women who are alone." "I know exactly what people do, Claire," I told her. "I spent 31 years stopping them from doing it to other people." She didn't fully believe I had it handled. I understood that. From the outside, a 73-year-old widow exchanging daily messages with a man she'd never met in person looks like exactly the vulnerability everyone warns about. She couldn't see the file on my kitchen table. She couldn't see that I'd already traced the photo, already started a timeline, already begun building toward something I couldn't fully name yet, even to myself. What she could see was her mother, talking to a stranger online, smiling at her phone, in a way she hadn't seen since before her father died. I let her worry. I didn't let her stop me. Week 8 is when the money conversation really began, though not the way you'd expect. Richard didn't ask for anything. He told me a story instead, a permit issue with his contract renewal, paperwork held up by a bureaucratic snarl in Lagos, a fee of $800 he needed to clear before he could get back to international waters, and, eventually, come visit me in person once the contract ended. He was very clear that he wasn't asking me for it. "I'd never ask you for money, Nora. I just need to vent to someone who understands how absurd bureaucracy gets out here." He said he'd figure it out himself, probably borrow against next month's pay. I sat with my coffee the next morning and thought about that sentence for a long time. "I'd never ask you for money." It's one of the most reliable tells in the entire playbook. Say the thing you're not supposed to say, so that when the actual ask comes later, the person remembers you saying you'd never do it, and trusts you more for having said it. I knew the move. I'd seen it described in fraud bulletins, in trainings I'd sat through a dozen times over 3 decades. And here it was, live, aimed at me, performed with enough warmth that even knowing the mechanism, I still felt the pull of it. I still felt, for one unguarded moment, the urge to say, "Let me help." That's the part that should scare people more than it does. Knowing the trick doesn't make you immune to the feeling behind it. It just means you get to choose, with open eyes, what to do with the feeling. I chose to wait. I told him I hoped it worked out, that bureaucracy was the same nightmare everywhere, and I didn't offer $1. 2 days later, he wrote that he'd found a way to sort it, and thanked me for just listening. No ask. No request. The $800 evaporated from the conversation entirely. It wasn't really about the $800. It was a test, and I'd passed it the way he needed me to pass it, by listening sympathetically, without volunteering money, which told him I was the kind of mark who needed a direct, specific, well-justified ask rather than a vague opening. Some marks offer money the moment they sense distress. Those get a different script entirely, a faster one. I'd just shown him, without meaning to, which version of the playbook to run on me. I didn't understand that's what had happened until much later, reading back through my notes with someone who understood this work far better than I did. At the time, I just thought I'd dodged something. In truth, I'd been quietly sorted into a category. The second ask came in week 10, and it was for $2,000 a customs fee, he said. On equipment the rig needed cleared before a safety inspection, and if it wasn't cleared in time, the whole platform would shut down, and the crew, including him, would lose 2 months of pay waiting for the next contract cycle. This time, the ask was direct. This time, he said the word, money. I told him I needed a day to think about it. He said, of course, completely understanding. No pressure, please don't worry about it on his account. I spent that day doing 2 things. First, I priced exactly how a real oil and gas company handles customs fees on industrial equipment, which I will save you the lecture, but it is never, under any circumstances. The personal financial responsibility of a single contracted engineer, paid out of his own pocket, wired to an account that wasn't even in the company's name. Real companies have customs brokers. Real companies have legal departments for exactly this. The story didn't survive even the lightest professional scrutiny, and I had 31 years of professional scrutiny just sitting there, waiting to be used. Second, and more important, I made the decision that would define everything that came after. I sent him the $2,000. I can hear you. I can hear exactly what you're thinking, because I thought it myself, sitting at my kitchen table with the wire transfer form half filled out. Why would a woman who'd already caught the fake photo, already built a file, already known the mechanism of the test he'd run on her, why would she send a known scammer $2,000 real dollars? Because I needed him to trust me completely before I built the thing I was actually building. Because every dollar I sent was a dollar of evidence, a documented transaction with a paper trail leading to a real account, a real routing number, a real human being who had to exist somewhere to receive it. Because the $800 test had taught him I was a patient mark who needed direct asks, and I needed him to believe that lesson completely, so that when the real ask came, the big one, he wouldn't smell anything wrong. I called my contact that week, a man named Dennis Okafor, a fraud investigator I'd worked alongside twice during my banking career, now retired from the bureau, but still consulting on elder fraud cases through a regional financial crimes task force. I'd called him in week 7, the day after I traced the photo, and told him everything. He'd told me, in careful, measured words, exactly what I could legally do, and exactly what I absolutely could not. You can document, he said. You can engage. You can even send money if you understand you may not get it back, and if every transaction is traceable and reported. What you cannot do is anything that crosses into entrapment of a specific individual, or anything that puts you in contact with the operation outside controlled, documented channels. The moment this starts looking like you're running your own investigation, instead of feeding evidence to people who can actually prosecute you, stop helping, and you start becoming a liability to the case. Dennis was not a warm man on first impression. He had a flat, clipped way of talking, like every sentence had already been cross-examined before it left his mouth. But 3 calls in, I heard him laugh for the first time, a short, surprised bark, when I told him I'd already started a file before I'd ever called him. And he said, "Most people call me crying. You called me with homework." I think that's the moment I stopped thinking of him as my investigator and started thinking of him as something closer to a partner in this. He never once, across 4 months, made me feel foolish for how it started, only careful about how it needed to end. I want to be honest about something. Part of me, in the early weeks, had fantasies of catching Richard Hale myself some clever trick, some moment where I revealed I'd known all along, and he'd be left exposed and humiliated, with me as the architect of his downfall. It's a satisfying picture. It is also, almost entirely, fiction. The actual work of stopping people like this is duller and more important than that. It's chain of custody. It's documentation. It's making sure that when this case eventually reaches a prosecutor, every piece of it can stand up in a courtroom rather than collapsing because an angry widow decided to play detective. I let go of the fantasy somewhere around week 9. What replaced it was something better, though it took me a while to see it that way. A plan built with Dennis, methodical, slow, designed not to satisfy me but to actually work. The $2,000 went out in week 10, wired to an account under a name that wasn't Richard Hale Marcus Donaldson, a name I wrote down and underlined twice. Dennis logged it. The task force logged it. Somewhere in a database I'd never see, a thread connecting Richard Hale to Marcus Donaldson got a little thicker. Richard thanked me with a warmth that, even now, knowing everything, still unsettles me a little when I think back on it. He said the rig wouldn't have to shut down. He said he didn't know what he'd done to deserve someone like me. He said, and I remember this sentence precisely because I wrote it down the moment I read it, I haven't let myself want anything in 3 years. And then you happened. I sat with that message for a long time. Whoever typed it understood exactly what an isolated, grieving woman needed to hear. The cruelty of it isn't that it was a lie. The cruelty is that it was constructed, with precision, out of the truth of what loneliness actually sounds like when it finally gets answered. I didn't write back for almost 2 hours, not because I was scheming, because I needed to remember, in my own body, that the feeling the message produced and the truth of who'd sent it were two completely separate things, and I needed to hold both at once without letting either one cancel out the other. Then I wrote back something warm and ordinary, and the conversation went on as if nothing had shifted. But something had shifted. I had stopped being only a target. I had become, without him knowing it, an active part of an investigation that was now 3 months deep. With a paper trail, a task force file, and a retired federal investigator reviewing every message I sent before I sent it. For the next 3 weeks, the rhythm of daily messages continued, warm and steady, while underneath it Dennis and I built the actual architecture of what would happen when the real ask came. Because we both knew it was coming. $2,000 for a customs fee is a test of a different kind than the $800 story. It's a test of capacity. It tells the operation exactly how much a target is willing and able to send. And once they know that number, the real ask always follows, usually within a month, usually framed as an emergency too urgent to think through carefully. Dennis had seen the pattern across dozens of cases. They'll come back with something bigger, he told me. Something with a deadline. Something that makes patience feel like cruelty. Watch for the clock. He was right almost to the day. In week 13, Richard told me his contract had ended early. The platform was being decommissioned ahead of schedule. The whole crew let go without the severance they'd been promised. A dispute with the company that he said could take months in arbitration to resolve. He said he had almost nothing in savings, because most of his pay over the last 3 years had gone to his daughter's medical bills, an old wound he'd mentioned before, but never with numbers attached. He needed to fly home. He needed, specifically, $15,000 flight, a deposit on a small apartment since his old lease had lapsed during the contract, and just enough to land on my feet until the severance dispute resolves, which my lawyer says could take 4 to 6 months. And then, for the first time in 4 months of conversation, he said something he'd never said before. I know how this sounds, Nora. I know exactly how it sounds. A man you've never met, asking for $15,000. If you can't, I understand completely, and I mean that. But I didn't have anyone else to ask. You're the only person in my life right now who feels like home. I read that message standing in my kitchen, and I felt, even with everything I knew. Even with the file and the task force and Dennis's careful instructions sitting in my phone, I felt a genuine pull toward him. Toward whoever had learned, across hundreds of conversations with hundreds of women, exactly which sentence dissolves hesitation in someone who has spent 4 years being nobody's home. I think that's the part I most want people to understand. Watching this, the scam doesn't work because the victims are foolish. It works because the architecture of loneliness is universal, and someone industrial enough, patient enough, can build a key that fits almost any lock, given enough time and enough data about what that particular lock looks like from the inside. I called Dennis that night instead of answering Richard right away. "This is it," he said. "This is the real ask. Everything before this was reconnaissance." We talked for almost 2 hours. Not about whether to send the money. We both knew I wouldn't be wiring $15,000 into an account under a name like Marcus Donaldson, no matter how the story was dressed up. The conversation was about what I would send instead. Because here is the detail that made this case different from every other Richard Hale story unfolding at that exact moment. On some other woman's phone, in some other kitchen, I wasn't going to refuse him. I was going to give him exactly what he asked for, in a form that would force a human being, a real one, with a real face and a real photo ID, to physically appear and sign for it. Dennis had used this exact mechanism twice before, in cases the task force had built against courier networks for elder fraud operations, not romance scams specifically, but the underlying principle was identical, and it transferred perfectly. When a scam operation needs to physically collect funds rather than receive a wire transfer, they almost always use a courier, someone local to the recipient address, someone who picks up an envelope or a package and forwards its contents or value upstream, taking a small cut for the errand. The courier is rarely the architect of the scheme. Often they're barely aware of what they're actually facilitating, recruited through gig work apps with vague job descriptions, paid in cash for package pickup, never told what's inside, or why an elderly woman 3 states away is involved. But to collect a package requiring an adult signature with photo identification, sent under restricted delivery, the courier cannot remain anonymous. The postal carrier verifies a government-issued photo ID in person before releasing anything. And if nobody matching the named recipient is there to show it, the package simply doesn't change hands. It gets held, not handed over. That was the plan. Not refusal. Redirection. I want to walk through exactly what I told Richard, because the construction of the lie back at him is, I think, the most satisfying part of this whole story, and I don't want to summarize it. I want you to hear it the way he heard it. I wrote, "Richard, I want to help you. I do. But I need to tell you something about myself that I haven't said yet, because it's embarrassing for a woman my age to admit. I don't trust wire transfers, not because I don't trust you, because 11 years ago, before Gerald passed, we lost almost $6,000 to a fraudulent wire that the bank could never trace or recover. I've never sent a wire transfer since, not even to my own daughter. It's not about you. It's a wound from before you and I ever met." This part was true. Every word of it. Gerald and I really had lost money to a wire fraud, years before any of this, not 6,000, closer to 4, and we had recovered most of it through the bank's fraud department, where I happened to work, which is a detail I left out for obvious reasons. But the core of the story, the wound, the reason for my caution that was real, which is exactly why it worked so well as a lie wrapped around a truth. What I can do, I continued, is send you something else. I have $15,000 in a CD that matures next week. I want to convert part of it into something I can mail you, directly, a cashier's check, sent through the postal service, with adult signature required, so it's fully insured and trackable the entire way, and so neither of us has to worry about wire fraud risk on either end. I know it's slower. But I need to do it this way, Richard. I need you to understand that about me. He wrote back within 20 minutes. He said he understood completely, that he respected my caution more than he could say, that of course he'd wait for the check, that the timeline still worked, because his flight wasn't booked for another 9 days anyway. Then he asked the question Dennis and I had been waiting 4 days for him to ask. Where exactly do you want me to have it delivered? I'm actually staying with a friend right now while I sort out the apartment situation. Would it be all right if it went to his address instead of mine? There it was, the courier's address, dressed up as a friend's apartment. I said, of course, completely understanding, and asked him to send me the address whenever it was convenient. He sent it that same evening, an apartment complex in Ohio. 4 states from where I lived, a name attached to the unit that wasn't Richard Hale, and wasn't Marcus Donaldson either. A third name. Dennis added it to the file with something that, over the phone, sounded almost like satisfaction. 3 names tied to one operation, he said. That's not a loan scammer anymore, Nora. That's a network, and we just got our first physical address attached to it. I spent the next 2 days preparing the package with a precision that, looking back, felt almost like the most honest work I'd done in months. Inside the envelope, a cashier's check for $15,000, made out not to Richard Hale, but to the name on the apartment unit Richard had sent me. If I was sending a check, it needed to be payable to whoever was actually going to be standing in that doorway, and Richard had been careful enough, or careless enough, to hand me that name himself. Dennis flagged something important when I told him this. If they're smart, they'll catch that the check is in the wrong name and refuse to cash it. If they're sloppy, they'll try to deposit it anyway, which gives the bank a second documented identity to pursue. Either way, you've created a problem they have to solve, and every problem they have to solve on their end is a thread we get to pull on ours. I sent Richard the tracking number, the way an excited, trusting woman would eagerly, the next morning, with a message that said I hoped this proved how much I wanted to help him land on his feet. Then I waited. 3 days later, Dennis called me himself instead of texting, which told me before he said a single word that something had happened. It was collected this morning, he said. 11:14 a.m. Eastern, signed for in person. By the name on the package? By a name. Not the one we expected, but a real one, with a real photo ID the carrier verified before releasing anything. We've got a face on the postal carrier's delivery record, a name, and now a physical location tied to actual human movement, instead of an anonymous wire transfer account that dead ends in some jurisdiction we'll never touch. It wasn't the end. I want to be honest about that, because the version of this story where one elderly woman's clever envelope single-handedly dismantles an international fraud operation is satisfying, in the way a movie is satisfying. And it isn't quite what happened. What happened is slower and, I think, more important. The courier turned out to be a 20-year-old working 3-gig economy jobs at once, told by an online contact that he'd be paid $200 to receive a package and forward the contents to an account, with no understanding of what the package actually was, or why an elderly widow 3 states away had sent it. He was interviewed by investigators within the week. He wasn't prosecuted. He cooperated immediately frightened, and genuinely unaware that he'd been one link in a chain stretching back toward operators he'd never met and couldn't identify, communicating with him only through encrypted messaging apps, paying him through cryptocurrency he didn't fully understand how to use. But he gave investigators something Richard Hale's operation had never given anyone before: a verified, real-world point of contact, a digital trail leading from his phone to the people who'd actually recruited and paid him. And months after my own part in this ended enough thread for the task force to begin pulling on an operation that, by the time charges were eventually filed, was found to be running dozens of separate Richard Hale-style profiles simultaneously, targeting widows and widowers across multiple states. I never found out the real name of whoever I'd been talking to for 4 months. I'm not sure anyone ever will. Not fully, these operations are often staffed by rotating typists working from scripts, sometimes coerced themselves, working for handlers who remain several layers removed from any single conversation. The Richard Hale who told me he hadn't let himself want anything in 3 years was probably never one person at all. He was a role, performed by whoever was on shift, following a script built from thousands of conversations with thousands of women like me. I think that's actually the saddest part of this whole story, sadder even than my own 4 years of grief. Somewhere in that chain of people, the typists, the couriers, even some of the low-level recruiters there, are almost certainly people who are themselves trapped, coerced into facilitating harm against people exactly like me, profiting almost nothing while the architects further up the chain stay invisible and untouched. Justice in cases like this, when it actually arrives, has to be aimed carefully. Not at a 20-year-old gig worker who thought he was doing a strange but harmless favor for $200. At the people who built the machine and kept it running. The check, by the way, was never cashed. The bank flagged the name mismatch within a day of it being deposited, exactly as Dennis predicted, and froze the deposit before a single dollar moved anywhere. I got my $15,000 back, every cent of it, 4 months after I'd first sent it out the door. I never told Richard the check had bounced, or that any of it had unraveled. I let the conversation simply taper, the way these operations sometimes do when a target stops producing a message every few days instead of every few hours, warmth cooling into something distracted, until one week, the messages from his account simply stopped altogether, no explanation, no goodbye. I don't know if that was a decision made by a person or an algorithm somewhere, deciding I was no longer worth the labor of continuing. The night I realized he wasn't writing back anymore, I did something I hadn't planned. I took the silk scarf out of the drawer where I'd kept it, still folded in its tissue paper, and I sat at the kitchen table with it in my lap for a long time, running my thumb along the hem the way you'd check a hem for a loose thread. It was just fabric. It had always just been fabric. But I sat there long enough for my tea to go cold, because for 4 months, someone or something had been the most consistent presence in my daily life since Gerald died, and even knowing every single thing I knew, even having engineered the entire ending myself. Some old, stubborn part of me had still felt less alone because of it, and that part of me didn't care that none of it had been real. I think that's worth saying honestly, on camera, instead of pretending the ending felt purely triumphant. It didn't. Not entirely. It felt like justice. And it also felt like another small loss layered on top of an older one, and both of those things were true at the same time, sitting in my lap, in a scarf the color of a sky that never existed. What I did after that was call my daughter Claire and tell her everything the file, Dennis, the cashier's check, the courier, all 4 months of it laid out plainly, the way I should have told her from the very beginning. She cried on the phone, not from fear this time, but from something closer to pride, and she said, "Mom, you ran your own sting operation and didn't tell me." And I said, "I ran it carefully, with a federal investigator's help, and I told you the moment it was safe to tell you, and we both knew that was the more honest way to say it." I also started something I hadn't expected to start. Dennis asked if I'd be willing to talk to other women, not publicly, not yet, just a small group through the task force's victim outreach program. Women who'd been targeted by similar operations, some who'd lost everything, some who'd caught it early the way I had. I sat in a community center basement on a Tuesday evening with 11 women, most of them widows, a few widowers. And I told them my story exactly the way I've told it to you, not to scold them for what had happened, or almost happened, to them. To tell them that the loneliness that made them vulnerable wasn't a character flaw. It was just what happens to a person when the home they built for 40 years suddenly has one fewer person in it, and that there's no shame in feeling that. even while you protect yourself against the people industrial enough to exploit it. A woman near the back, maybe 68, raised her hand and asked the question everyone in that room was thinking. How did you know? How did you know early enough to do something about it, instead of just losing everything? I told her the truth. 31 years of training I never fully retired from. A reverse image search I almost didn't bother running. A retired federal investigator who happened to still take my calls. And, underneath all of it, the simple decision to keep my eyes open even while my heart, against every piece of professional caution I owned, still wanted to believe. Most people don't have 31 years of fraud training sitting in their back pocket, she said. What about the rest of us? That question is the reason I'm telling you this story at all. Because the tools I used, the reverse image search, the documentation, the decision to call a real investigator, the moment something felt engineered instead of organic, those aren't secrets. They're available to anyone willing to slow down for one evening and actually look. The FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center exists specifically to receive reports like the one Dennis eventually filed on my behalf. And the more documented cases like mine they receive, the more threads they have to pull on networks just like the one running Richard Hale. Reporting isn't admitting defeat. It's the only thing that actually starves these operations of the one resource they can't manufacture: anonymity. I'm 73 years old. I spent 31 years protecting other people's money, and then I spent 4 months and $15,000 I never actually lost protecting my own dignity, and somewhere in a federal file that I'll probably never see the end of. My cashier's check and a frightened 20-year-old's cooperation are sitting next to evidence that helped take apart something far bigger than one fake profile pretending to miss his dead wife. I still have the scarf. Pale blue, the color of a sky he said he watched from a rig that never existed, over water he never stood near. I kept it not because I'm sentimental about Richard Hale, there was no Richard Hale to be sentimental about, but because it reminds me of something true underneath everything false. That I was lonely enough to want it to be real, smart enough to make sure it cost him everything when it wasn't, and steady enough, even at 73, to do both of those things at exactly the same time. If you're watching this, and something in your life right now feels a little too good, a little too understanding, a little too perfectly built around the exact shape of whatever you're missing, I'm not telling you to stop believing people can be kind to you. I'm telling you to keep one corner of your mind clear enough to check. Run the photo. Make the call. Let one person in your life know what's happening before you're certain it's nothing. What would you have done, in my kitchen, reading that message that said he hadn't let himself want anything in 3 years? Tell me in the comments, and tell me your age, because I'd like to know how many of us are out here, still standing guard over our own hearts, even decades after we thought we'd already done all our growing up. There's another story I think about often, one I haven't told anyone outside my own family yet. A man named Walt, 3 counties over from where I live now, who spent 40 years on a farm his father left him outright, free and clear, no liens, no disputes, until the week he discovered the deed to half of it had been quietly transferred years earlier. His own signature sitting at the bottom of a document he never signed, in handwriting that was almost, but not quite, his own. He didn't have 31 years of fraud training. What he had was an old carpenter's level that had belonged to his father, and a stubborn refusal to believe a signature could lie to him the same way Richard Hale's photograph lied to me. That's a story for another evening. For now, go run that reverse image search. It takes 4 minutes, and 4 minutes is so much less than 4 months.